Good morning from those of you guys joining from the US, and good evening to everyone in China. And I see we have some people from elsewhere in the world, so hello to you as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I'm sure we have more people trickling in as well. My name is Devin Lau. I am the Assistant Director of Yale Center Beijing. And by way of introduction, since we have some new people here today, joining us for the first time for today's event. Yale Center Beijing is Yale's first and only university-wide center that spans all of its 14 schools. And we work with the professors of Yale to promote their wonderful cutting-edge research and to highlight all that's going on throughout campus. Of course, most of the world is still in some form of COVID lockdown. And so we've been able to do a lot of events via Zoom in the last year and a half. And so today we are honored to have Professor Quincy Ngan join us to talk about Chinese painting. Professor An is assistant professor in the history of art at Yale University, as well as a research fellow at the Macmillan Center of International Studies. He received his bachelor's from the Chinese University of Hong Kong and his PhD from the University of Chicago. He is a co-recipient of the 2018 Luce ACLS Reading Workshop Grant, and his research focuses on color, pigments, and materiality in traditional Chinese painting, as well as representations of skin in Chinese art from the pre-modern era and thereafter. His articles have appeared in the Metropolitan Museum Journal, Yishu Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, and the Mingqing Yanjiu. And I've had the privilege of listening to many of Professor An's lectures. He's always very enthusiastic and very engaging. So I can think of no better person to talk to us about today's topic. And so with that, I will turn it over to him. I see that many of you have already turned on your webcams, which is great. If as many of you as possible can turn on your webcams so that we can be engaging in person as much as possible during the lecture. That's always nice instead of having Professor An talk to, just a blank screen of names. It's always nice to see some people. So without further ado, here is Professor An.
Thank you, Davin. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. So thank you, Davin, for the kind introduction, and thank you all for attending this talk. Let me just start. So this talk is an excerpt of the chapter 1 of my book manuscript. In chapter 1, outline the methodology for unpacking the communicative power of color in Chinese painting. So this talk will be about methodological approach, the approach to look at Chinese paintings through color. So that is the main goal of this talk. So my manuscript is completed, and the book proposal and 2 chapters are currently being reviewed by our university press. So let me just start. Scholars Jerome Silbergau and Amy McNair have once addressed the general lack of evidence in research on color in Chinese painting. They said very little has been written about the use of color in Chinese painting. Over the centuries, many artists and writers about the arts of painting cultivated an unspoken prejudice against any prominent use of or even discussions of color in painting. The intellectual outlook of the literary class helped shape this aesthetic sensibility, which was derived from the great value they laid on detachment from worldly things and the stilling of human emotions, on harmony and simplicity. These scholars, referring to the literati, who monopolized the writing of art history, art theory, and criticism, should have found it similarly displeasing to discourse on the techniques of painting in color. So this passage aptly captures the contours of color's historiography in traditional China. Today, over 30 years after Silbergau and McNair made this statement, I want to problematize the notion that there is a lack of discourse on color in traditional China. Sporadic accounts reveal that informed painters have long considered the choice and placement of color within a composition. In other words, today I want to show that there are other modes of discourse on colors that lie beyond our theory and criticism. Recent scholarship has already corroborated this. For example, in his clearing weather after sudden snowfall, the Yuan dynasty painter and Taoist practitioner Huang Gongwang uses cinnabar to color the sun over snow-laden terrain. As scholar Susan Huang speculates that this contrast between a bright red sun and vast snowscape resonates with the contrast between yin and yang and fire and water, crucial aspects in the theory of Taoist alchemical practices. Also, in his self-portrait, Shang Shenmo draws himself entirely red with ink, but situates himself in a landscape completely painted red, thus creating an unusual visual contrast. The poems inscribed on the painting comment on the fall of the Ming Dynasty. Based on these poems, scholars Jonathan Hay and Chujin Li point out that the overwhelming red of the landscape is a visual pun. Red or Zhu in Chinese refers to the Ming Dynasty, the Zhu imperial family. Scholars hold that by situating himself in a red landscape, Shang Shenmo is reviewing his loyalty to the Zhu family regime. The same sentiment clearly runs through Shang Shenmo's own poems and the other two inscribed on the portrait by his contemporaries. Similarly, the painting on the left, the loyalist and descendant of the Ming royal house Bao Shanren, used the red in a similar way. As scholar Li Huisu has shown, he painted bamboo in red, hinting at the homophones Zhu red and Zhu bamboo. These scholars show us an important approach for understanding color. It is that an artist's choice of where in a composition a color is applied or on which motif it is used are potential clues for unpacking the meaning of color. However, there's no study to the best of my knowledge that synthesizes these scholars' brilliant works into a unifying approach to study Chinese painting color. To do justice, today we will first look at a host of textual records that attest to and demonstrate the pervasiveness of the positional significance of color in the history of Chinese painting. Then my talk will be divided into 3 parts. We will then look at 3 paintings focusing on the placements of Azurite and Malachite in the composition. Second, I will show that the Yuan master Zhao Mengfu in his self-portrait manipulated the location of Azurite and Malachite in the composition to reinforce the messages connected by other pictorial motifs, namely the orchid and bamboo. Third, I will show that in his Tao Gu Presenting a poem, Tang Yin uses azurite blue and the direction of a houseboy's gaze and posture to draw viewers' attention to the wine flask, reinforcing the significance of wine in Tao Gu's fiasco. Fourth, finally, I will show that Wen Zhengming likewise uses azurite and malachite to guide viewers and connect different scenes in his hand scroll, heavy snow in mountain passes. Altogether, I argue that these works bespeak the 3 scholars' attentions to where a particular color is applied and how colors work with specific motifs to connote intended messages. In other words, color can deepen our understanding of paintings and their artists. While scientific analysis of pigments can, of course, deepen our understanding of color, I want to add that the inscriptions, the specific motifs bearing the color in question, and the unique formats of Chinese painting are all parts of the discourse of color. To begin, let me start with the first part. A host of textual records attest to and demonstrate the pervasiveness of the positional significance of color in the history of Chinese painting. Gu Kaizhi, one of the earliest masters of Chinese paintings, wrote that when depicting figures in faraway mountains, one should use lighter and subtler colors as opposed to the thicker and more intense ones reserved for the foreground. So here, the planned variegation of colors thus reinforces and corresponds to compositional design. This awareness of color and its placement continued through the Ming Dynasty. For example, the art critic Zhang Jingfeng was particularly interested in where and how azurite, malachite, and brushwork were applied. He described in detail how these elements work together to construct the landscape, serving as the basis for his evaluation of a painting's authenticity. Such meticulous descriptions of technique pervade his painting treatise, The Thoughts of Dong Tu. In addition, color can cultivate a focal point that channels viewers' attention to particular motifs. Well, whether it is a painter's intention or not. For example, in the passage where the 15th century painter Dai Jin is said to have used red to color the robe of a fisherman. The color captured the attention of the painter cum government official Xie Tingxun, as well as the emperor who was overseeing his inspection of submissions by court painters. The paintings, Dai Jin's paintings, was likely executed in his signature ink monochromatic style, which would have made a figure in red stand out. So while the emperor was amazed by Dai Jin's coloring technique, Xie Tingxun, who was jealous of Dai Jin's talent, reminded the emperor that red could not have been worn by a fisherman, as it was reserved for government officials. Offended, Xie Tingxun and the emperor discard all of the paintings that Dai Jin has presented to them for enjoyment. So as this textual records reveal, and all this text reveals, color, the color chosen, and the motif to which it was applied. Each has specific meanings that shape viewers' perception of the work and the painter. Now, the second part of this talk, Zhao Mengfu, self-portrait. The celebrated scholar, painter, and calligrapher, Zhao Mengfu was in the royal line of the fallen Southern Song dynasty. He also held a government position before the advent of the Yuan dynasty in 1279. Being one of the most talented scholars in the country at that time, he was summoned to serve in the Mongol court. Although holding high positions, he was criticized and doubted by both Mongol government officials and leftover citizens due to his relation to the former dynasty. During his time serving at the Mongol court, Zhao Mengfu painted this painting, The My Landscapes of Xie Yu, as a work expressing a complex mix of emotion. Indeed, Zhao Mengfu appropriates an anecdote about the ancient Xie Yu. So this anecdote is about, when asked by Emperor Ming of the Eastern Jin dynasty to compare himself to Yu Liang, which is another government official, Xie Yu replied that he was better than Yu Liang in terms of lodging one's mind in nature, implying yearning for reclusion. Zhao Mengfu also chose reclusion, but Emperor Shizhuo or Kublai Khan summoned him and forced him into government service. By 1299, while Zhao Mengfu painted the self-portrait, he had already resigned from this unwanted position. While the mind landscape of Xie Yu revealed his intention to withdraw from serving the Mongol court, his self-portrait reveals a mixture of sentiments more complex. In his self-portrait, as you can see here, Zhang Mengfu painted himself walking with a staff by a bamboo grove. A boulder in thick azurite appears in the lower left, standing out from the green landscape and small rocks washed in faint azurite along the river. Next to the prominent blue rock, there grows an orchid swinging toward Zhao Mengfu as he passes, and I'm sure you can see the orchid right here. His gaze roaming back over it. The coloration differs from his use of the two minerals in the My Landscape of Xie Yu, the previous painting that I showed you, in which azurite and malachite are more mixed. This emphasis of the blue rock, or more importantly, the orchid, which is a multivalent trope in Chinese literature, prompt us to discover the specific meanings at this point in Zhao Mengfu's life. Scholars, Dr. Shan McCausland speculates that the self-portrait represents Zhao Mengfu's new role as the director of Confucian education in 1295. He proposes that the portrait with the motif of bamboo and orchid stands as a kind of preemptive response to the questions Southern society may have had about the direction his academic leadership was to take. That's to quote him. In the following, I would like to offer a more nuanced opinion by unpacking the specific meanings of bamboo and orchid by the poems composed by Zhao Mengfu himself and his friends around the time when the portrait was made. Let's go back to a year before he painted the self-portrait in 1298. Zhao Mengfu was invited to copy the Diamond Sutra in the court in today's Beijing. And his journey to taking this task comprised a complex internal struggle. As Zhao Mengfu took up this task in the third month, his friend Fang Hui wrote him a poem titled Seeing of Zhao Mengfu, who was appointed to copy the Diamond Sutra. Fang Hui's poem begins by mentioning Zhang Mengfu's resignation from his position in the court and transfer to a local position in 1295. Fang Hui states that Zhang Mengfu's talent in art has cost him his freedom and dignity, and it caused him to become inundated with requests from vulgar people. Fang Hui's poem then praises Zhang Mengfu's appearance and his achievement in calligraphy and speculates that Zhang Mengfu, like many ancient great calligraphers, will soon become a prominent figure in the country. Not unexpectedly, while Zhang Mengfu was in the court, he was offered a position in the Imperial Academy, which he then declined. In the same year, Zhang Mengfu composed a poem that echoes the sentiments from Fang Hui's poem. Zhao Mengfu poems mentions his young son grabbing his clothing and refusing to let him go. His poem reveals that Zhao Mengfu feels sad about the lonely fate of his wife. Zhao Mengfu continues to say that his peaceful and reclusive life was hindered by his talent, echoing Fang Hui's poem. So it would seem that he felt working for Mongol regime was a burden. Yes, that is true, but of course his feeling was not so simple. So let's take a look at another poem that he composed in 1298. In 1298, Zhao Mengfu also composed the prose poem on the elegant bamboo. It was written just 1 month after he had returned from writing the Diamond Sutra in the capital, which is, I believe, very important for understanding the motif bamboo in his self-portrait painted just 1 year after this. The first line of his poem praises the delicate, slender, and elegant appearance of bamboo, which echoes his renditions of bamboo in self-portraits, as you can see on the top of the screen. Zhang Mengfu's prose poem then praises at length the many aspects of bamboo, from the historical locations of its growth to the aromatic sentiment that it conveys. Importantly, Zhang Mengfu evokes Wei Nu, or Lady Xu Mu, from the 7th century BCE, who was married to the king of Mu of Xu. So loyal to her home country, Wei Nu lamented that she could not go back to Wei after it was invaded and her current country, Xu, was not strong enough to help. This lament over the fall of the country mirrors Zhao Mengfu's situation as a descendant of the Song dynasty, who then became a subject of the Mongol Yuan. So continuing the trope of Wei Nu, Zhang Mengfu mentions Qiao, which refers to the meandering Qi River, a branch of the Wei rivers, and a song describing the scenery of the Wei, recorded in the Book of Songs. The song Qiao also uses the elegant appearance of the bamboo along the Qi River to glorify the virtue of a gentleman. So here, as you see in self-portrait, Jiang Mengfu also painted the bamboo. The bamboo grove where Jiang Mengfu emerges also borders a river, plausibly or definitely, hinting at this trope of the gentleman in his prose poem and Qiao. Zhang Mengfu prose poem that evokes the renowned scholar Zhong Xuan, that is Wang Cang, who after the fall of the Han Dynasty defected to serve the warlord Cao Cao. Zhao Mengfu probably used Zhong Xuan, who is also a lover of bamboo, as a comparison, as a foil, implying that they both had served more than one lord. Zhao Mengfu's prose poem thus reveals a complex sentiment. On the one hand, he laments the fall of the Southern Song dynasty, and as a descendant of the Song's royal house, upholds the virtue symbolized by bamboo. But on the other hand, he yearns for the opportunity to serve, just like Zhong Xuan. The bamboo in his self-portrait likely conveyed the same conflicted sentiments. The orchid in self-portrait, emphasized by the blue rock, seems to reinforce Zhang Mengfu's yearning in the prose poem. A sing, where of course there are many, many meanings associated with an orchid, but a single orchid, a single branch of orchids, as you can see in the painting, in the portrait, a single branch of orchid is a trope referring to Confucius' melody of the delicate orchid. In this song, Confucius is frustrated by his failure in seeking employment in various vassal states, as he sees a single orchid growing in solitude. Just like here, you can see a single branch of orchid growing in solitude. Confucius finds that the plant mirror his situation in that he is not among the worthies. The plant, like him, is isolated and unrecognized, despite having a fragrance that befits a king. By placing a conspicuous azurite rock beside a single orchid that would otherwise have been ignored, Zhao Mengfu guides viewers to experience the very moment when the disheartened Confucius discovers the sorrowful plant. Zhao Mengfu's portrait thus conveys a desperate yearning for recognition. Not unexpectedly, Zhao Mengfu accepted an offer to serve the Mongol regime as the supervisor of Confucian schools in the southern region in 1299, the very same year that he painted this portrait. So more importantly, the foregoing discussions reveals that Zhao Mengfu in his self-portrait manipulated the locations of Azurite and its counterpart, Malachite, in the composition to reinforce the messages connoted by orchid and bamboo roofs. It is not entirely clear who is the intended audience of Zhao Mengfu's self-portrait. The small size of the work, as well as lack of inscriptions by other painters or poets, bespeaks a private or limited viewership rather than public display. Other than functioning as a self-expression with Zhao Mengfu himself as the sole audience, the work may have been painted for his wife and Zhao Mengfu's second son, who was just less than 10 years old in 1299. Zhao Mengfu's wife, Guan Daosheng, also painted bamboo groves, indicating her understanding of this time-honored trope. In fact, in the accompanying enchromium, as you can see on the screen, written by Song Lian from the early Ming Dynasty, Song Lian states that Zhao Mengfu's grandson asked him to write the enchromium, so implying that the painting has always been in the family's possessions from the late Yuan to the early Ming, and thus implying a family viewership. As you can see here on the screen, highlighted that I've highlighted this text. Now, let's move on to the third part of this talk and look at another example that shows painters pay attention to which color and where it is applied in a composition. Tang Yin was one of the most promising scholars in the 15th century. In 1498, Tang Yin came first in the regional exam and attempted to take the national exam the following year. However, his prospect of taking the national exam disappeared due to his involvement in a cheating scandal surrounding Cheng Mingzhang, an examiner who, under torture, involuntarily admitted selling the national exam questions. Tang Yin has visited Chen Mingzhang just before the scandal exploded, so seemingly involved in the scandal despite his innocence. Tang Yin went through a trial and his regional degree was received. Tang Yin then made a living through his paintings and calligraphy. In his Tao Gu Presenting a poem, as you can see on the screen, Tang Yin used mineral pigments to color not only the two key figures, Tao Gu and courtesan Qin Erlang. At the center, but also a seemingly unimportant houseboy and wine flask. The houseboy clothing and the wine flask were washed with azurite. Situated in the lower left, the two motifs, which are relatively small in size and located at the edge of the composition, stand out from the large garden rocks and banana trees in ink and muted colors that dominate the painting's lower half. As scholars observe, the painting illustrates a scene from the story of later Zhou official Tao Gu on a diplomatic mission to the state of southern Tang. When the southern Tang official Han Sizai finds out that Tao Gu has fallen in love with a young woman, he sends a courtesan, Qin Yuan, to impersonate her. One night, Tao Gu meets the courtesan and mistaken her for the woman, presents a poem to her. The next day, when Tao Gu attends a banquet, Han Zizai summons the courtesan and asks her to sing the poem. Tao Gu is deeply humiliated. However, the story of Tao Gu has multiple versions. While the overall plots are similar, the details varied. So more importantly, there is no study on the relationship between this painting and these different versions. So we don't have time to go through each of these four major versions of the story, but while the overall plots are similar, they are different in terms of their details. So in all these texts, the courtesan is portrayed as wearing torn clothing or meeting Tao Gu in a way station doing all kinds of cleaning chores. All these details do not match the scenery or the details depicted in the painting. However, wine, which is highlighted with azurite in Tang Yin's painting, play an important role in the versions written by the playwright Dai Jin, which is right here in the Yuan dynasty. So in other words, the placement of blue reveals the relationship between the painting and the play, proving the significance of color. Wine, drinking, and intoxication serves as the threads of the drama's plot. In the play, Tao Gu is a lecturer disguised as an aloof diplomat. In Act 1, courtesan Qin Yuan is introduced by Han Zizai to Tao Gu at a banquet. Han Zizai orders Qin Yuan to serve some wine to Tao Gu. Since Han Zizai is present, Tao Gu refuses to be served by a courtesan, stating that a gentleman like him should refrain the company of women. As Han Zizai and Qin Yuan seek to intoxicate Tao Gu pretends to be drunk and fall asleep. In vain, Han Zizai leaves the banquet upon discovering a riddle that Tao Gu secretly wrote on the wall. In Act 2, Han Zizai solves the riddle and come to know the location of the inn where Tao Gu is staying. Han Zizai then sends Qin Yuan to seduce Tao Gu. At night, Qin Yuan wears ordinary clothing and arrives at the inn by the way station. The two encounter each other in the inn's garden, which coheres with the settings in Tang Yin's painting. Also, the lit candle, as I pointed out with that blue arrow, the lit candle, which signifies nighttime, also coheres with the temporality of the play. Qin Yuan tells Tao Gu that she was the wife of a way station servant who has passed away. The play implies that due to darkness, Tao Gu cannot recognize that this woman in disguise is the same courtesan as the one he met before. So Tao Gu then invites her to sleep with him. In the next scene, Tao Gu swears to marry Qin Yuan as she demands a token of his love. Tao Gu then composes a prose poem titled Happy Time on a piece of paper and signed it. As Qin Yuan receives the poem, she read it out loud, and here the translation is on the screen. Good marriage, bad marriage, all depends on heaven. Sleeping together for just a night at the postal way station, I can bid farewell to the immortals. The pipa lute had played all the love songs, but it has few true listeners. How many years does one have to wait to get phoenix glue and repair the broken string? So here, phoenix glue refers to a glue made from the mythical bird that can repair any broken string. It also refers to the act of marrying a widow. So the song thus implies that Tao Gu is Qian true listener and he is determined to marry her. In Tang Yin's painting, courtesan Qin sits at the center, facing Tao Gu as she plays a pipa lute, echoing exactly the lyrics' third line. Also in the painting, a piece of paper, brush, and inkstone with ink are placed next to Tao Gu, mirroring the scenarios of the play. Toward the end of Act 2, Tao Gu willfully drinks the wine presented by Qin Yuan as they sit and enjoy each other's company. Tao Gu then decides to marry, determined to marry this widow. Wine and the paper bearing Tao Gu's poem continues to play important roles in the third and the fourth acts. But here, in the interest of time, I will just go through it very quickly. Upon learning that Qin Yuan obtained a love songs from Tao Gu, Han Zizai decides to invite Tao Gu to a banquet and have Qin Yuan sing it for everyone. So in the banquet, Tao Gu still cannot recognize that the courtesan is actually the widow that he met at the inn because it was very dark there. And by refusing and he refused to drink the wine served by her or any courtesan because he just tried to maintain his image as a disciplined gentleman. So Han Zizai then orders Qin Yuan to sing the salacious lyrics that Tao Gu wrote to her. As Qin Yuan finishes, Tao Gu criticizes her for singing such a licentious song. So presenting the token, Qin Yuan reveals that the lyrics was written by Tao Gu and that they has enjoyed each other the other night. As the handwritten lyrics is shown to everyone, Tao Gu becomes furious as Johnny denies the accusation. So he is trying to save his face. Qin Yuan then complains about Tao Gu's ingratitude and reveals more embarrassing details. So, with the goal of humiliating Tao Gu achieved, Han Zizai then said he can marry the couples on the spot. So, Tao Gu then blames the current fiasco on being drunk the night they met. So, sort of admit Qin Yuan, what Qin Yuan have said was true. At the same time, Tao Gu pretends to be intoxicated and faint asleep. So here you can see being drunk, the wine definitely play a very important role in the play, as you can see in the painting. So in the last act, Act 4, Qin Yuan re-encounters Tao Gu. Qin Yuan, like Tao Gu, seeks refuge from Gentleman Qian, who is a local warlord. The two men drink wine, and Gentleman Qian summons the courtesan to accompany and sync with them. And when Qin Yuan and Tao Gu meet each other, Tao Gu once again pretends not to know Qin Yuan. So she then presents the piece of paper bearing the licentious song and signature and threatens to kill herself. So the play ends with Gentleman Qian marrying the couple. So here, as you can see, surrounded by the large decorative rocks executed with ink washes and brushwork, the azurite blue of the houseboy's clothing and wine flask are arresting. His body, including his face, is partly concealed by the stove. He's shown bending toward the stove while using his left hand to support himself like a contortionist. He is riveted on the blue wine flask, warming in a basin above the stove, and apparently Tang Yin uses azurite blue and the houseboy's gaze and posture to draw attention to the wine flask, reinforcing the significance of wine in Tao Gu fiasco, as portrayed in the play. So Tang Yin's poems inscribed on the paintings further strengthens his allegiance to the play. It reads, "One night intimacy at the inn, a mere short sound, can already prove our encounter. If I were Tao Chengzi, Tao Gu, I would not blush in front of you." So while he situates himself in the shoes of Tao Gu in the second part of the inscriptions, Tang Yin clearly points to the scenario in which the narrative is driven by the inn and the piece of paper bearing the song. He's clearly referring to the play. The use of azurite blue in Tang Yin's painting thus reveals a complex network of meaning. He uses blue motifs to construct a narrative that mirrors the narrative of the play. So I have talked about the placement of blue in two paintings. So now let's move on to the last painting, the last part of this talk. So other than Tang Yin, the great painter and calligrapher Wen Zhengming also uses color to guide viewers and connect different scenes. Completed in 1532, Wen Zhengming's Heavy Snow in Mountain Passes depicts a red-robed scholar traveling across snowy mountainous terrain. According to his inscriptions, which appear at the end of the scroll, right here, Wen Zhengming painted this scroll at intervals over the span of 5 years. It begins with a journey that he took with his friend Wang Cong during the winter of 1527. Wen Zhengming mentions he and Wang Cong sojourned to a monastery not far from Suzhou, where they are based. At that time, the snow had piled up several inches. Wen Zhengming said at that time, myriad mountain cliffs lost their verdant foliage, while 10,000 trees petrified and fell. At this particular moment, his friend Wang Qiong presented to him some fine paper and asked him to paint. Cheered by the moment, Wen Zhengming began to depict the snowy landscape. In this painting, Wen Zhengming successfully conveyed how myriad mountain cliffs lost their verdant foliage. In 5 out of the 6 appearances of the red-robed scholar, who is also the painter himself, there are mountainous ridges lightly touched by azurite and malachite. These few areas of blue and green follow the scholar as he travels, marking the moments of his appearance. And yet, the instances of azurite and malachite green are so sparse and faint that they strongly imply a loss of verdant foliage. So, in other words, examining the placements of Azurite and Malachite in this scroll reveals how color acts in accordance with the intermittent viewing experience of a traditional hand scroll, and also reveal the artist's intended message. Blue is where the message is. In his first appearance, the red-robed figure is riding a black donkey, crossing mountain valleys on a wooden bridge. Of all the snowy mountains behind him, only one is touched by Azurite and Malachite. As I has pointed out by the arrow, scholars is here, the blue mountain, the colored mountain cleft is right here. So the triangular shape of this mountain form looks to be pointing toward the scholar. Following his direction, our gazes follow a meandering path through groves of bamboo and pine trees across a frozen river and deep valley until we see him again in his second appearance, as you can see here. In his second appearance, the red-robed figure is still riding a black donkey amid a grove of pine trees. Directly above the red-robed scholar, two mountain ridges are touched with Azurite and Malachite, again marking the location of the scholar in this snowy landscape. He and his friends approach a small village at the shore of a frozen river. They reappear later, crossing the river. As the entourage crosses, the thin ice starts to break. At the far shore, a red-robed scholar has arrived safely. A pine tree bends toward him, over him in greeting. Directly above the pine trees and the scholar, several ridges of the downward sloping mountain are touched with Azurite and Malachite. In each of these three appearances of the scholar, a thin layer of the two minerals is applied to a mountain ridge close to him, tracking his journey's progress. So among the 6 appearances of the red-robed scholar, only the 4th is unmarked by blue-green ridges, as you can see here. In this 4th scenario, we see the scholar riding a black donkey along a path again. He has passes through steep mountains and a village hidden deep in a valley. Before him, the path turns narrower, and the mountains steepened. On the path, vertical cliffs emerge from the right, while a frozen river appears on the left. So obviously, this lack of Azurite and Malachite in these sessions impart a strong sense of barrenness, connecting the loss of verdant foliage. So next to this terrain of formidable mountain ranges, the red scholar reappears in a thatched hut surrounded by a dense grove of pines, as I pointed out with the blue arrow. So sitting by the window, the scholar contemplates the landscape in the front. Here, two mountain ridges bend toward him, as you can see here. And they are touched by Azurite and Malachite. And again, the two minerals mark the 5th appearance of the scholar. As the scroll unrolls further, the scholar's journey continued. He has passed a towering mountain and a series of red-walled buildings. Among oblique frosting petals that erupt from the ground, we see the red-robed scholar for the 6th and final time, as I pointed out by the blue arrow. Here he appears at the end of the zigzag path to the city gates. The tininess of his optical size in these sessions enhances the remoteness of the scene. Not unexpectedly, the scholar is flanked by two mountain cliffs, both of which features ridges touched by Azurite and Malachite. It's so obvious that I don't have to point out that they are right here. Again, faint applications of the two minerals correlate with the scenes in which the scholar appears during this long, snowy journey. Toward the end of the scroll, all traces of the scholars vanished. He is nowhere to be found. Instead, we see a range of snow-capped mountains and a line of geese flying over the gate. At the end, the craggy landscape becomes a vast slope of snow. In fact, the snow is so thick that it blots out all the features of the landscape. It is on this vast expanse that Wen Zhengming inscribed recollections of his journey with Wang Cong 5 years prior. So, to conclude, the foregoing discussions on paintings and textual records reveals that the practices of using color to create a focal point. These focal points aim to guide viewers to important motifs that reinforce the narratives constructed by other pictorial motifs and inscriptions. The Yuan master Zhao Mengfu manipulated the locations of Azurite and Malachite in the composition to reinforce the messages connoted by the orchids and bamboo in his self-portrait. In his Tao Gu Presenting, a poem, the painting in the middle, Tang Yin used azurite blue and the direction of a houseboy gaze and posture to draw viewers' attention to the wine flask, which reinforces the significance of wine in Tao Gu's fiasco, which is based on the play. Wen Zhengming likewise used azurite and malachite to guide viewers and connect different senses in a hand stroke. So the inscription, the specific motifs bearing color in question, and the unique formats of Chinese painting are all clues for understanding the communicative power of color in traditional Chinese painting. So of course, while not all colors connote meanings beyond sheer coloration, and not all painters attend to where a color is applied, the potential of this way of looking at color for deepening our understanding of painting is reasonably persuasive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating and so many interesting and varied examples. We have some time for Q&A. So anybody in the audience who has questions, now is a good time to get ready to ask them. So we can do this either way. So you can either enter the questions directly in the chat box and I can read it aloud for everybody and Professor An can, of course, answer them. The other option is you can raise your hand. And so if you look at the participants section, there should be a raise hand function that I will be able to call on you and unmute you, and you can actually directly ask your question to Professor An. So anybody with questions, please feel free to either enter them in the chat box or raise your hand, and we'd be happy to have some time for discussion. Usually it takes people to warm up a little bit or to type out their question. So I, as the moderator, have the privilege of asking the first question, I guess, to help people warm up here. Professor An, can you talk a little bit about the use of Malachite and Azurite as a, I guess, the cultural significance of that and sort of the materiality of it and why those colors and why those materials?
Well, so this is a part of my book chapter, and in another chapter, I have demonstrated azurite is a very special color in the Ming Dynasty. It was a tax, and because of the constructions of the new capital in Beijing and other um, architectural projects in the whole country, in the 15th century, azurite has been very expensive during the 15th century. And I argue that supply and demand has drawn viewers and painters in the 16th century draw the awareness of where the azurite is applied, and other symbolic meanings of azurite. And so this is why azurite is more invested than other color in the two paintings that I shown you. As for in the Yuan dynasty, in Zhao Mengfu's paintings, and azurite has long been a color that has many literary references. There are some, for example, there is Rhapsody, written by Tang Yin, also compare the talent, the cultivations of a gentleman to Azurite. Right? So that's why Azurite is a very well-known color, loaded with different kinds of symbolic meaning. Thank you.
Great, thanks. And it looks like Alfredo also had a similar question, which was, is there any connection between the importance of these colors as well as to the connection between the importance of jade throughout Chinese culture and Chinese history?
Right. And I guess this is a wonderful questions, and we can answer these questions in many different ways. From methodological perspective, the answer is yes. Rocks, many different rocks, all has meaning in traditional China, and we know from azurite to jade to other different kinds of rock, they're all associated with the scholar studios. They're scholars rock, the cultivation of the scholars, and so this is a broad general answer to that. But in particular, we should look at each artworks. We should unpack the meanings of a color or a particular rock in its original context. So in a painting, a color has specific meaning. And if we look at azurite as a scholar rock in a different context, not painted in the painting, not used in the painting, it will have different meanings, and even different artworks, different painter will evoke or appropriate different aspects of the symbolic values of azurite. So there is no one answer to that question. Thank you.
Great. And keep those questions coming. And feel free to raise your hand. That way you can, you don't have to just hear me asking these questions. Um, Anita asks, what is the significance of the red color among the trees?
Great. And I think I have the same questions for myself. And then I noticed that they probably means wintertime. The red usually signify the change of colors in wintertime. So I guess those red reinforce the winter landscape. Thank you.
Great. And then Nishi asks, have you been able to look into malachite and azurite as a depiction of mountains in maps, and whether, aside from indicating that these are Lux products, but are there other kind of uses maybe in maps or other kinds of depictions besides paintings?
Well, Lizzie, nice to meet you again, and thank you for your wonderful questions. And there are some ways to answer these questions. The quick answer is no. I have not looked at maps. I focus so primarily on paintings. But if we think broader, like 千里江山图, the Wang Shimeng painting, there is some panorama landscape there. And if it is a luxurious products, and of course I cannot comment on individual map, but we know maps are no, of course we know they are no ordinary objects. So in particular for luxurious products, I guess that word luxurious is also loaded with it's very vested, right? So, for example, that exhibition by the National Palace Museum, 魏好物, the fineries of forgeries. Of course, those objects with many azurites and malachite, they are not cheap, not too cheap to make, and their textual record mentioned that they are expensive. There are nouveau riches, spend 1,000 pieces of gold to buy a paintings like that, attributed to Li Xixuan and Li Qiaodao. So whether that is lux a luxury is in the eyes of beholders, how deep your pocket is. But it is definitely has certain tenor in it. It has the valorization power to valorize the social standing of the owner. Thank you.
Great, and it looks like
I think there is a hand on the screen. Shall we take Iris' question first, then we can go back to the questions at the chat.
I was just going to do that. So Iris, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay. Hi, Professor. I'm Iris. So, I just came up with a question. In English, blue has the meaning of melancholy and sadness or sorrow, but I'm just wondering, does blue in Chinese painting have an emotional expression?
Well, I generally will say color as a huge is different from pigments as a powder form, right? So they are two very different things, and I am not aware of a painting that used azurite to convey melancholy, but perhaps there has some sense of melancholy in Zhao Mengfu's self-portrait as well. So not to discourage you from looking at or discourage us from exploring melancholy and blue, which I believe is also a very Western perceptions of color in China, right? But not to discourage this direction to look at Chinese art. I would say melancholy is also a possible theme in Chinese paintings. It's just it doesn't on top. It's just there's no painting come on top of my head that is about that. But I encourage. I will take a look, and I also encourage you to continue to look at this color. Thank you.
Great. And that's a great question. So anybody that has more questions, feel free to continue to raise your hand and ask that way. Anita also asked, how long would such scrolls that we've looked at, or especially the long scrolls that we looked at, how long would something like that take to paint?
Well, so for the Wen Zhengming painting, he said the inscription said it took him 5 years to paint, and he has some very meticulous paintings, like those in the two paintings in the National Palace Museum that he wrote on the inscription that he painted scroll, hanging scroll intermittently. It took him 3 years, 4 years to paint sometime. They are very meticulous. But sometimes some scroll, they can be painted in very fast, the very expressive style, right? And in fact, this is not something that we can tell because otherwise, if the painter did not write down how much time or when he paint, then it is impossible to gauge how long it takes. Thank you.
All right, and it looks like Siming has a wonderful question. The question is regarding the usage of malachite and azurite. Is it prevalent among all of Chinese painters in similar periods, or is it a preferred method only by a small group of elite painters? So I guess the prevalence of this usage of malachite and azurite, and what is the social implication and ramification of using such colors?
Well, I guess my book has explored these questions. I focus on 16th century, the 50 years of the first half of the 16th century. So I guess your questions already explained it or answered your questions, right? Your questions is self-explanatory, right? So when we look at the meaning of pigments in Chinese painting, or perhaps when we look at pigments in the arts in different cultures, other formats, we should not assume there is one definition fit all, right? So different time periods will have different understanding of the same colors. Different social classes, as Ximing has mentioned, will consider the colors differently. For example, for an emperor, Azurite and Malachite is not too expensive for him, but for an ordinary citizen, it will be very different. It will be the contrary, right? So different social classes will look at the meaning of a color in different way. So as I said, the meaning of a color must be contextualized in Chinese painting. So I also mentioned earlier to answer that particular questions on a small group of elite painter. Yes, of course, like Zhao Mengfu and aware of perhaps he aware of the literary reference of Azurite, which is related to Tang Yin, the Rhapsody of Kongqing Azurite. I talk about this in a publication in 明清研究 already. And I also, as I answer perhaps and later questions earlier today during the late Ming, Azurite and Malachite, paintings with Azurite and Malachite are also popular and expensive. Nouveau riches use this painting to valorize their social standing. So yes, your answer, there is social implication, but that implications is period by period and should not use one interpretation to decipher the works from other time period. Thank you.
And I'm sure you talk a little bit about this in your book as well, or maybe even a lot about this. But can you explain a little bit more about the actual like physical malachite and azurite and the production of these colors? How do they come about, and where it fits into kind of the social economic trade networks as well?
So where China has Azurite and Malachite mines deposit, right? And in the early Ming, Hongwu and Yongle periods, Azurite and Malachite were mined using they are mined by the government, and they are also collected as tax. And so here from the textual records in Daming, Huidian, and other missive written by government officials, we know there is a high demand of Azurite and also Malachite at that time in the early Ming Dynasty. And these minerals were mined by, of course, the poor citizens being exploited by local government officials. And then these minerals will be collected at local region and then transported to Beijing for the constructions. And later in the Ming Dynasty, the single whip policy, 一条边法, that taxation policy, and Azurite and Malachite purchased at Beijing, and so you can see the minerals were mined locally and then citizens or merchants transport their minerals to Beijing, and the government will purchase the mineral in Beijing. So the government do not need to buy, do not need to pay the transportation tax for the pigments. So there is also, there are many can be said about all this process of how to obtain the pigments is a very good question. And the other aspect is that their constructions dwindle, the demand dwindle, starting from the 16th century. And there are some records say that there are too much pigments, too many pigments in the imperial storage. And so that's why toward the late Ming, Azurite and Malachite become more available to the general public. Thank you.
Anita has many great questions. Another one, I'm going to ask them in actually the flipped order just to help transition a little bit better. So are artifacts from the Song Dynasty relatively rare? And I guess to expand that question, when we're looking at these Chinese paintings, because I think many people in the audience are not as familiar with Chinese artwork, how rare are these pieces that we're looking at? And I guess it's hard not to have that like comparison to the Western art tradition as a comparison, but maybe just how rare are these pieces? Help us put this into context of what we're looking at.
Right. First of all, the Song Dynasty has long been considered as the golden age of Chinese paintings, and there are some studies that talk about this paradigm. Song Dynasty painting is the best. How this assumption has obscured our understanding, has blocked our understanding in the entire development of Chinese painting. And there even some scholarship, some scholars say anything after the Song, they are just decline. The Chinese painting decline after the Song Dynasty. So I think that is a very unfair view. There is a view that privileged the Song. But I also see where that ideas come from. So first, Song Dynasty paintings are rare for sure. There are less Song painting than Qing paintings because of the ravages of time. But also Song painting has long been considered as the paradigm, not just in existing scholarship, but also in the Ming Dynasty, Yuan Dynasty, right? So yeah, so that's how I would answer that question. Thank you.
And then also a question about the characters. They themselves are so beautiful. Are they considered to be art? I mean, yes, but how can we sort of understand, especially for people who don't understand how to actually read the characters? How can we understand characters as art within Chinese painting?
Right, and I guess there's a word that is Chinese calligraphy, and they are arts, of course, and calligraphy has been an art like since the 4th century, when there are treatises about how to write, how to appreciate, how to collect, what to collect writing, and is cohere with the rise of scholars, this social class. Lothar Laterals, his book Mi Fu has talked about this. Craig Kunis, in his book Art in China, also has a very, very wonderful summary on that, the art of the scholar elite, right? And so it is, of course, art. It has historical precedence before the Wen Zhengming painting that I shown you. But as to answer Davin's questions, and of course, we don't need to, well, sometimes we do need to know the characters in order to completely to understand the meaning of the characters, right? To understand the art, right? But we can also look at the brushwork, right? The abstract quality of the brushwork, how to manipulate the brush, the dexterity of the calligrapher, and to look at, just to compare two pieces of calligrapher. So for example, how Shen Zhou, the Ming Dynasty painters and calligraphy, how his calligraphy were inspired by Wang Tingjian, something like that. How Dong Ziqiang was inspired by Mi Fu. So we can look at these formal relationships between different works by different painters, calligraphers, without necessarily knowing the contents of calligraphy, but of course, if we know Chinese characters, it will help. It can allow us to understand word and images. You know, Chinese painters from time to time inscribe their poems onto their paintings, and the words, the inscriptions, sometimes it's a poem, work together with the picture, and together they form, have additional meaning. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor An, for a fantastic presentation. Wonderful information, especially for many of the people in the audience who may not be as familiar with Chinese painting. And of course, your book is coming out soon, hopefully. Do you want to do a quick plug for that?
Well, the manuscript is completed, and my proposal and 2 chapters are currently being reviewed by University Press. And it was the COVID year has caused quite a bit of delay. I got the time to write because I don't have to travel to office, but at the same time, everything is sort of just delayed, and I think I probably will get a contract next year. Yes, thank you.
All right, so very much looking forward to that book. Based on this talk, I know that it will be very fascinating, and there's, this is a very unique look at this field, and I think many people are very excited for the unique work that Professor An is doing. So, all right. So with that, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I will unmute everybody so that we all have a chance to personally thank Professor An. And also, as per our tradition, if you are willing to turn on your cameras, this is a good time to do so that we can have a group picture of sorts while we say goodbye. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Professor An.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Be well, everyone.